When the BBC published the shocking story of the death of a Gazan Palestinian with Down syndrome, David Collier decided to investigate how true their version really was. What he found shocked him. After speaking directly with the family at the centre of the story, he tells me just what he uncovered. I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. David Collier, thank you for joining me. It's good to be able to talk to you. I've been following your work for a long time, and the latest piece that you've put out, investigating a BBC article, is actually mind-blowing. So I'm hoping that we can go through that blow by blow and understand the results of your investigations.
Well, firstly, many thanks for inviting me on. It seems like it's a mutual appreciation society because obviously I follow your work as well. Yeah, I'm glad to run through the story with you. It was a mind-blowing story to investigate.
So just to set the scene, the BBC published an article on BBC News website, which was about a Gazan Palestinian who had Down syndrome, who they claimed had been savaged by an Israeli army dog during an army raid, and then effectively separated from his family and left to die by the IDF, with the family only discovering the decomposed corpse 7 days later. And of course, as you would expect, such a horrific account made it round the world very, very quickly. So I'm going to give a spoiler here, which is I just want to explain how I believe your investigation reveals this story should have been described. Instead of Palestinian Down syndrome guy savaged by Israeli army dog and left to die, it should have been terrorist family in live battle with the IDF used Down syndrome relative as a human shield, and his family then potentially left him to die after the IDF administered first aid medical treatment. Is that accurate?
We weren't there. Right? I wasn't there, you weren't there. So I don't know exactly what happened. But given all of the evidence that I have managed to compile, conversations that I've had with both the brother and the sister was there at the time, and I've had several days worth of exchange with her now, I would say what you have just said is probably the most likely scenario of what took place.
If that's the case, you saw this article, you realised there was likely to be a lot wrong with it from your previous work on this sort of issue. What then would you say was wrong with it, in short, and we'll go into detail in a moment, and what is the real story?
Firstly, there were three people credited on with the article, on the BBC article, three journalists. Only one of them is a native Arabic speaker. And she is a Palestinian semi-activist based in Jerusalem. So the primary issue we have here is an agency issue, where BBC journalists, even if they want to play fair, are completely dependent on a Palestinian journalist who is an activist to find the people to interview them, to feedback, to search out, to challenge. Everything that an article would need to make it rigorous is dependent on the motivations of a Palestinian journalist in Jerusalem. And the BBC should not be in that situation ever. And sadly, the BBC is in that situation almost every single time they write an article on Gaza. Because you put these names into Google and it's there. Any due diligence at all. It took me 4 seconds to find out that the brother of Muhammad works for Islamic Jihad.
There we go. So let's get into those details, because that's really, I think, what's interesting here about this story. Many will often accuse journalists or non-journalists putting stories out there of being on one side or the other and twisting things. And I think what you're doing is not that. It's trying to undo a piece of activism journalism that was put on the BBC website. Now, you say that you did some basic Googling. Now, I think we can agree after your investigation that there was a guy called Mohammed Bar who did have Down syndrome living in Gaza, and he did die when they say he died in that article. Is that a good place to start?
I also am pretty convinced he is a member of that family. Everything you say is true, and I also believe that he is, even though the evidence for it, as we will come to, the evidence for it is somewhat thin, I also believe that he is a member of that family.
Okay. And so what we're looking at here is going online. You didn't go to Gaza. But you could use the internet. You searched on Google through social networks like Facebook, and you found the protagonists from this story. You found the relatives of Muhammad. You found his brothers and sister. You found the characters that appeared in the BBC story. Tell me what you found about them when you found their pages and you scrolled through their open information visible for all to see.
Well, my first job with unraveling, because you're right, this is all about unraveling the story. Okay, and stories sometimes they develop a life of their own as they develop. That wasn't so much the case with this one because it was pretty much formed completely almost from the start. But it's to go back and find where the story came from in the beginning. Who was the first person to mention the story online? So that's quite easy to do. The first explicit mention of Muhammad came from his brother on the evening, I think it was about 8 o'clock if I remember rightly, on the evening of the 3rd of July. Now that was the day of the attack itself. The attack must have happened in the early hours of the 3rd and obviously progressed during the course of the day. He posted about 8 o'clock. So that was my first clue. I had the source of the online story. Thankfully, lucky for me, he tagged some of his family members. And that gave me access, obviously, to their timelines as well. My first major finding was the fact that Mikhail, he's actually a journalist, he's a media person, and he's quite a high-ranking media journalist for Palestine Today TV, which is the Islamic Jihad propaganda channel. So I'm looking at this man. This is the guy that introduces a story to the world, and he works for the propaganda arm of a prescribed terrorist organization. And I went through his timeline looking for images that would help me prove this. And I found images of him at a special Islamic Jihad anniversary event. He's on the stage with the Islamic Jihad fighters, looking down on the crowd. So he has VIP media access to Islamic Jihad. That was the first person that I found.
For those who maybe don't know, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is kind of what it says on the tin. It's a terrorist organization in Gaza, which operates much like Hamas. Indeed, many of its members and militants were involved in the atrocities on October the 7th and plenty of other times as well. So it's not a fringe group over which there's any doubt. He is effectively connected, at least you're saying, with this terrorist group, and he has this VIP access as a reporter for a channel which is affiliated to them.
Okay, firstly, let's get this absolutely right. Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is more extreme than Hamas. Whereas Hamas has made some noises in the past, at least pretending to make accommodation, Palestinian Islamic Jihad never have. They are the group that is more extreme than Hamas. Secondly, absolutely, this man is an important part of the Islamic Jihad propaganda apparatus. So we now know that the family that was attacked, the family house, is affiliated to, at the very least, Islamic Jihad. The second issue I had was the mother. Now, Muhammad's mother is the person who basically carries the BBC interview. She's the person that the BBC have relied on most for the story that they tell everyone. And the BBC even state in the article that Muhammad's mother is a widow. Well, that's true. It's also true that on each anniversary of the father's death, the family members post a video remembering their fallen father. And the video is a Hamas funeral. And the video shows Muhammad's father, or the mother's husband, being buried and carried in Hamas colours. I think it was in 2002, so that's the height of the Second Intifada. So we now know that not only was Muhammad's father a terrorist, but the main witness for the BBC is a Hamas terrorist wife.
So Nabil Yazji is the mother, and you have identified through her social media postings that her husband, in fact, had this Hamas funeral. And this image makes it very clear. He's wrapped in the Hamas colours and flag, and he has the Hamas headband around his head, indicating his membership and affiliation of Hamas. So far we have a Palestinian Islamic Jihad son and a Hamas father, and these are the two people so far, well, the mother and the son, who the story is relying on. And take us on from there. So they now could have known this, the BBC, as easily as you did, in a few clicks from London, that there was already terrorist involvement in the family that they were relying on for this human interest story. Let's keep going.
Right. Now, in the accounts of the family, because now obviously I had a pretty good network of online accounts, but just to clarify for precision, it wasn't the mother's social media posts that gave me the father, it was the children. The children had posted about their father and tagged the mother. So that post came from the timelines of the children. Anyway, now I've also had the timelines of the children. Now, with social media, with Facebook, some timelines are more open than others. Some people hide behind privacy profiles or only post to friends. Other people post globally and are open. So I was able to look at several timelines, and I was noticing that there was a lot of pro-terrorist posting on almost all of them. But in the accounts that they gave of the events of the 3rd of July, they spoke about two brothers that had been arrested in the house. And thankfully, and they were being very friendly to me and very helpful, they named them. They gave me one of the names was Adam, and the other, I think, from memory, was Raphael or something like this. So I knew now the names of the two people that had been arrested. So I went looking on their timelines, and on the timeline of one of them, Adam, going back quite a way, there was also an image of Adam standing there alongside a weapon, doing a V sign. And I knew that, okay, this guy's a terrorist. This guy is going to be affiliated here to one of the terrorist groups. So at that point, I knew we were dealing now. This is why the IDF had gone into the house. We were dealing now with active terrorists who were fighting for Hamas.
The story, how it was originally presented, very much gave the sense that the Israeli army arrived at a normal domestic setting, which also happened to belong to a family with a son who had Down syndrome, and then savaged them with a dog. And what you found out so far is that actually the IDF came to a house that housed known terrorists, that was from a family where the dead father was a known terrorist. And we even have pictures online of some of the sons connected with terrorism and with weapons, and one son who actually worked for a propaganda arm of a terrorist organization. So there is, as you say, I would imagine, some grounds for the army during this ongoing war to have turned up at the house in the first place.
Well, firstly, absolutely. And let's be clear, I mean, even the timelines of the females were quite horrific. They may not have been holding weapons, but they were posting celebrations of terrorist attacks. The terrorist attack on the 27th of January 2023 in Jerusalem, where 7 Jews were slaughtered outside a synagogue. Sarah, the daughter, actively, openly celebrated it. So there were many signs anyway of all of the family members. This was a terrorist family. And we also have to remember that the IDF weren't just there by accident. There was an ongoing battle taking place in that very neighborhood. We also know, of course, one soldier got killed in that neighborhood. So it is a fair assumption, given that the two sons at the very least, let's say there could have been others, but the two sons at the very least were able-bodied men belonging to terrorist factions, and there's a battle taking place around them. And now that leaves you with two alternatives. Either they are hiding or they are fighting. That's their role in this. It's one or the other. Or they had been fighting and now they're hiding.
this for me is something really interesting the BBC could have done with this story, which is we've read endless allegations, let's call them, from the Israelis that Hamas and other terrorist organizations in Gaza use civilians as human shields. They hide behind them, and that they know that when Israel goes after the terrorists, they will end up killing innocent civilians, and then that is their defense for what one might euphemistically call collateral damage. But so here is a absolutely perfect example, actually, if the BBC had wished to use the evidence they've been given of such a case. And it doesn't mean to say that if someone is an innocent civilian member of an otherwise terrorist family, that's already pushing it, they deserve to die. But it does rather contextualize the side that Israel put over and over again. It gives the BBC this beautiful opportunity to actually demonstrate it with this story. And of course, a story where a guy with Down syndrome, who himself almost certainly isn't a terrorist, ends up dying, is a sad story. But what this story could have done is illustrate the very manipulative and cynical way that the Palestinian terrorists used his illness, his condition, in order to fight Israel and then trap them into this story which would be misrepresented the world over with the help of the BBC.
Absolutely. I mean, look, let's be honest. I mean, the situation's tragic, whichever way you look at it. There was a man. His name was Mohammed. He was about 24, 25 years old. Had Down syndrome. He was bitten by dogs. It's pretty clear he was, and he died. And that's tragic. And even when I was investigating and writing this story, I had to be careful not to be appealing to be flippant about the situation, or it really happened. And yes, you're absolutely right. The more you dig into the story, the more the evidence seems to lean towards Muhammad having been deliberately used as a human shield. I mean, firstly, in an interview that took place on the 6th with the Brothers TV channel, Palestine Today, I had to move into transcript and translate it. The translation's not been professionally done, but I think it's good enough because we're dealing with numbers. The mother seems to say that there were 17 people inside that house.
17?
17. Now, if I had a family member who had Down syndrome and a dog came in, and it's pretty sure that the dog comes in before the soldiers, because it's a terrorist house, the dog is looking. So the soldier's not with the dog, because then the soldier could command the dog not to do it. So the soldier is not there. One dog is there. Now, why didn't the family try to stop it? 17, and at least 2 able-bodied terrorists, probably armed, which tends to suggest that the family and Muhammad were not necessarily together. Because otherwise, 2 terrorists, they've got guns, why not shoot the dog or fight the dog or do something? 17 people is a lot of people.
So again, this is, at this point, something we don't know. This is conjecture.
Yes.
But what I'll say as well is that it's no more conjecture than most of the story as it was presented by the BBC. And therefore, I think you're bringing it up as a possibility, a rational possibility, is valid. I wouldn't, and I'm sure you wouldn't, have presented the story in a cut and dried way as that having happened. But it is a reasonable alternate explanation to the one that was put forward by the BBC. And I think that at that point as well, if you're looking at a property with known terrorists in it, from a known terrorist background and family, it becomes far less simply a case of a family with a child, an adult child with special needs who is then attacked by the army. It's already cast in a completely different way. And I want to move us on at that point and say that the detail that they did give in the BBC story at that point is that the IDF sent a medic in to treat the injured Mohammed, who had been bitten by the dog. Now, at this point, let's talk about what the injury was from the dog, because it's being widely reported as a mauling or a savaging. But you mentioned that there were several different versions given by the witnesses themselves.
coming back to what you just said, because it is really important, my role in this was never to create a second, to say this is what happened. My role in this was to investigate the BBC story and to show that there were so many possibilities in there that the BBC should never have touched it, or at least if they touched it, then they should have gone with the evidence, which suggests a story very different to the one that they told. When it comes to that, we have to remember that we're dealing with people who did, even if they're terrorist family. The girls, for example, would have experienced some kind of trauma going through those, they're human beings. But looking at the stories that they told, there did seem to be conflicting injuries. Now, I think I saw somewhere it starts off with being the hands, the arm, then the chest. In an interview on the 6th, I think they included the face. Now, the issue with this is the brother Gabriel, when I first contacted him, he sent me a run of pictures of the house following the attack. And one of the things he did, he obviously showed me one with blood lines splattered on the floor. But he also sent me a video, and it's quite a horrific video, of the body. And they unwrapped the body for the blood. It's covered in some kind of carpet, and they unwrap it for, proof that this is Muhammad, that he's died. And as you probably know, these kind of videos are quite horrific to look at. And we can see from him that the damage, and there was damage, and it wasn't just a bite. He was attacked, which is why I leant towards him having been attacked alone somewhere rather than with family, because this seems to have been quite it's a dog. We don't know whether Muhammad turned aggressive. We weren't there. We don't know. But there's extensive damage, it looks, to the upper arm. But his whole chest area is a t-shirt, and the t-shirt is unbroken. And whilst it is dirty, it's clear that he was not bitten on the chest. It's clear. Now, in the BBC article, they explicitly mention that they've seen this video, because they say that the brother had handed them a video. This is how they knew that Muhammad had died. This for them was the evidence that they'd died. Well, if they were handed that video and they saw it, they know for a fact, because they have the evidence, that he was never bitten in the chest. And yet the article explicitly says that the mother says he was. They're printing something they know is not true.
Interesting there that you say you've had this direct contact with his brother. We mentioned it earlier. Let's go into that into a bit more detail. You did the responsible thing in investigating not just the BBC, but also this story. You wanted to find out what happened. And so you had direct contact with the brother, as the BBC had, and you asked questions as a journalist. So how do those interactions go in this case? You've been in contact with more than one, haven't you, of the family?
Yeah, firstly, the difficult thing, I always do this. I have no trouble. I want to get to the bottom of the story. The best people to talk to are the people that were there. I can at least ask them the difficult questions that the BBC never bothered to ask, if I need to. Also, people generally, they're quite helpful, especially, I'm a journalist. These are Palestinians in Gaza. They like talking to journalists. They like spreading, even if I'm just hearing their side of the story, it at least allows me to put in one or two questions that might try, not to trip them up, but to try to get the truth out of them. So it's about looking for phone numbers. So I phoned him, I sent him a message, and I asked him for photos of Ahmed, because I'd noticed online that the images they were using for Muhammad were all quite sad. They were all images of Muhammad sitting alone on the couch, standing alone here, standing in a corner, just looking quite derelict. And I don't mean to be disrespectful. I got the feeling, and again, this is just me and feelings, this isn't fact, I got the feeling I was looking at an unwanted pet. This is the feeling that I got from those photos. It was really sad.
And these are photos from before October the 7th, even they're historic family
by
photos.
The family of Muhammad before the event, and they were all recent. So the question of why these photos were taken in the week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks leading up to the attack, because these were all very recent photos, visibly, they looked recent. And I went looking for pictures of him. Now, I had access to all of the family. I had access to the mother, although the mother's timeline is pretty closed. But Sarah's timeline is pretty open. Gabrielle's timeline is open. Michael's timeline is open. Adam's timeline is quite open. Their other sister, Noor, her timeline is. So there's lots of timelines that were sitting there openly to be investigated, some of them going back over a decade. So I went looking for any mention of Muhammad or any photo of Muhammad in any of the timelines of his brothers and sisters. And it's always possible I miss something, but I checked thousands of posts and photos, and I did not see one mention of Muhammad before July the 2nd. Not one, not on any of the timelines. When I added that to the fact that the only images I had of him were quite sad and of him standing alone, what I wanted to do was I wanted to test the family to see if they could possibly give me a photo of him in a family situation, sitting around a table, a party, or just something, some family gathering that included him.
So to understand this a little better, you're effectively trying to find out more about their relationship with Muhammad and how in Gaza, both before and during a war, he may have fit in with his family. Did they have a kind of nurturing, loving relationship with him? Did they have any relationship with him? Did he live in the family home? Are these the sorts of questions you're asking yourself?
Well, look, the BBC article states explicitly or implies strongly that this was a very strong, loving family. The article opens that way by saying there was always his family. He was bullied at school, but the loving, nurturing family. This is how the BBC article opens. So this is a fact, if you will, that the BBC have presented to the world. The evidence given by all of the family since July the 3rd also strongly implies that they're brokenhearted, that they miss him, and this is more evidence out there. But evidence needs to be challenged. And if all of the available evidence that I have, both the lack of any mention of him up to July the 2nd, the lack of any images of him up until July the 2nd, and these sad photos that we were being presented with, didn't support the evidence that the family had laid out or the BBC had laid out. So I was perfectly justified in, yes, trying to gauge from the family what the actual relationship was, or to dig deeper.
So just to be clear, I suppose one could say, well, even a family that is pretty rotten towards a child with Down syndrome doesn't necessarily deserve a treatment where he's mauled by a dog or whatever. But my question is, are you at this point in your investigation wondering if he's even part of that family? Is that what you were trying to find out?
Firstly, everything is possible until it's proven, you know. And that's what my role as an investigative journalist is. It's to dig at to turn over every possible stone, every single one. Doesn't matter whether there's a low chance or high chance, whether it's nice or not nice. I have to turn over every single, in my head, every possibility. Now, if Muhammad had been a loved member of the family, if there was evidence that he was a cherished member of the family, then it removes some possibilities from the picture. For example, and now this is speculation again, but all I'm doing is providing there are terrorists in the house. What if Muhammad wasn't cherished at all? What if, and we do know that in Arabic society, this is all children like this, children that are afflicted can often be seen as an embarrassment and unwanted and a stain on the family and so on. What if he was actually used as a human shield? What if he was the one who was left near the front door in the first room while the others went off to hide? Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that if there is a difficult relationship there, then other possibilities come into play. This is where my mind was going. I wanted a picture of Muhammad with the family that would take all of those, because they're nasty options. They're not comfortable. I wanted to take them off the table. I wanted to be sure that there was some sign somewhere that Muhammad was loved by that family. And visual evidence, not just them telling me. So Gabrielle was the first one I asked. Now, Gabrielle provided me with an image of him with Muhammad as a child. He says, but I don't have any more. You need to ask Sarah. So I contacted Sarah, and I explained to Sarah I was working on a piece, and I was looking effectively for a family pic. I said, look, I've seen the pictures of him alone. I said, what I want to do is I want front page material. I want something that really grabs. Muhammad is 24 years old. Have you got a picture of him somewhere with him, with you, your family, at a party, and so on and so forth? And I waited a day. And the following day, she sent me a whole run of pictures of him as a child. Again, with family, with other kids. So obviously with the kid, and I began to get really suspicious of it, because it was almost as if they were deflecting the question. The question I was asking was quite simple. I asked again. And this time I said, look, thanks, Sarah. You've been really helpful. What I need a picture of Muhammad as he was when he was attacked, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years, a recent family photo of Muhammad as an adult with your family, a happy, something. And there was no response. And I published my article yesterday. I got a response from her today. And the response from her today makes absolutely no sense. She said to me, there are no photos of Muhammad with his family because the IDF took all our phones. Now, whilst it is true that the IDF probably did take the phones of the people who were in the house, it doesn't explain several issues. It doesn't explain why there were photos of Muhammad alone. It doesn't explain where all those photos of Muhammad as a child came from. And it doesn't explain why none of Muhammad's brothers and sisters and cousins who were not in the house don't have a photo of Muhammad as an adult with his family. In other words, now I have a real, and honestly, I'm more convinced than I was when I published that piece, that there is something truly rotten about the story and the way that it unfolded in that house.
And then there's also the piece of evidence that I saw you posted that another brother, Jad, actually used a picture of somebody with Down syndrome in an IDF uniform, because the IDF actually has a specific policy of helping and allowing those with Down syndrome who want to serve in some capacity, obviously not in frontline positions, to serve in the IDF. And he mockingly posted a picture of one of those IDF soldiers with Down syndrome, mocking him. Now, again, it is circumstantial, but it does tend to suggest an attitude towards Down syndrome that is not that of a loving, caring brother of somebody that has Downs themselves, right?
Look, all of the evidence that I have provided is circumstantial. And the BBC provided no evidence at all for anything. And all of the material that I found was available publicly online, because it was sick. It was a sickening find. I mean, obviously, I was going through, and as I said, thousands of these images, looking for something, and then you come across an image that openly mocks someone who is afflicted, and you think, what kind of family would do that? Their story does not make sense. It really doesn't, and it should never have been published by the BBC, ever.
To sum up, as we sort of get to the end, there are two extra pieces of the puzzle that I want to bring in. One is the IDF's response, because you also have acquired the full IDF response that the BBC quoted from, and you have some things to say about that. And then is the BBC's headline change, because I thought that was quite important myself.
Yeah, absolutely important. And from what I understand, there may be more news about that coming out. The headline change, originally, the BBC had basically just said that a Down syndrome man, had been mauled and had effectively died. I can't remember the exact headline, but it was quite a passive, far more passive headline. And this led to an uproar in the anti-Israel activism. They wanted the BBC to be, they said this, as we do sometimes. Sometimes the BBC publish a headline to say an Israeli man died when we know he was stabbed to death, and we're not happy with the died. We wanted to say what happened to him. So the BBC apologized after, firstly, this article got viral. Anyway, as you said in the beginning, these kind of articles always go viral. The BBC apologized for the fact that they had ran such a weak headline, and they changed it into a much harsher one, which says that the Down syndrome man was mauled and left to die by the IDF. So that was that change. And as for the IDF statement, this exposes the motivations of the BBC more than anything else ever could, because now we have it all. We have the full picture here. We have the full statement from the IDF, and we have the carefully selected pieces that the BBC journalist added to the article. And the the IDF statement says two critical things. The lesser of them is that an IDF soldier died or was killed in the vicinity, which is why they say the medics and the soldiers left, because there was a battle, it was brutal, soldiers were dying, so soldiers left the house to go and fight the battle and tend to any wounded soldiers. In the BBC section, they only talk about injured. They don't mention the IDF fatality. Now, because we know where the battle took place, and we know when the battle took place, it takes 2 seconds to verify. And indeed, an IDF soldier was killed on that day, in that place. The second one was far more, because the IDF explicitly say that the dog, and a singular dog, had entered the house, detected terrorists, and mauled a man. Which means that the IDF are telling the BBC that there were terrorists inside the house. And the BBC did not place that into the article. And that's deliberate deception.
Not even as the IDF claims
Nothing.
kind of BBC attribution.
It's not there. They talk about terrorists in the vicinity. They do not tell anyone that the IDF statement says there were terrorists inside that house. And that is unforgivable. It really is unforgivable.
Well, even in the sense that they could have reported that and said the IDF alleges that, claims that, they just didn't even mention that the IDF justified it itself with the declaration that there were terrorists in the house. The viewer, the reader, would still be perfectly entitled, if they so wished, to say, well, we don't believe the IDF's evaluation, but they haven't even given the reader the opportunity to understand that that's why the IDF say this happened, because there were terrorists in that house. Is that what you're effectively getting at here?
Firstly, that's 100% accurate. This is complete. I mean, it's impossible to overstate the fact, the problem with them leaving this out. The other thing that statement does is it raises a second issue, and it's also important. The statement says that the IDF left the house because of that dead soldier and the battle taking place. Now, we know that took place on the 3rd, which is the same day of the attack. So we're left with a scenario where the IDF may well have been, if we believe the IDF statement, the IDF would have been inside that house for hours, not days. Which means then that Mohammed was there for 7 days before the family went back to retrieve him. it does open another possibility. And again, all I do is I throw possibilities up there that Muhammad was dead almost from the beginning. Also a possibility. And the family knew it. It's another possibility. There is no weak, everything about that is almost staged. But again, that's just making guesses. What we do know is that the IDF seemed to say that they weren't there, and yet the family, who apparently was so worried, didn't go back to check for a week. It's another question.
It is a complaint we've heard a lot from the international media that they're not allowed into Gaza without being on an IDF embed. So what we do know from that, though, and this is what I want to say, is that any story like this, human interest story with detailed interviews with Gazan Palestinians, by definition isn't coming from their usual reporting team who've gone into Gaza to get that information. It's been fed to them from Gaza, and then somebody like this BBC bureau staffer in Jerusalem you're talking about is then doing the detective work of presumably corroborating it.
Okay, well, a couple of things here. Firstly, I believe that's a bit of a strong man, because the BBC had journalists, they had a team in Gaza, and they flew them out. If it was so critical and so crucial for them to have a team in Gaza, why did they ship them out? One is now in Turkey, the other is now in Qatar.
So you're saying at the start of the war, they evacuated them?
Yeah, they evacuated one in December. Rafi, he's the main one. I think his name's Rafi, or Rushdie, I think. He flew to Turkey in December. And another one, I think his name is Adnan. I think he was shipped out a bit later, and he's now in Qatar. So again, it makes absolutely no sense for the BBC to be crying about the fact they have no journalists in Gaza when they did have, and they chose to ship them out. And secondly, I spent a few hours or days sourcing the material from London, and I know that everything they wrote was junk. So why is it that their journalists based in London can't do that work?
If one David Collier in London can do this, the enormous beast that is the BBC, full of Arabic speakers and full of journalists who do and don't speak Arabic, could have done exactly the same work that you did.
Probably better. Probably better.
Well, just they're better resourced. I would suggest you're being humble there. They couldn't do it better, but they could certainly do it themselves, which is the important aspect here.
This is the issue. It is about motivation. I have a motivation to find out the truth, and their motivation is very, very different. And I think that's obvious from the material that they're producing.
So I think that brings us to the end of your investigation and the news into this story. Maybe not the end of the reaction to it, because now what you have written is making its way around the world, obviously far less quickly and in far less enthusiastic form in some quarters. But I do think that it's interesting because, as you said at the beginning, you weren't there and don't know what happened. I wasn't there and I don't know what happened. But nor were the BBC there, and they don't know what happened. And I think Fergal Keane was not there and didn't know what happened. And the point you seem to make in your work, whether people like your theoretical suggestions or even your conclusions, is only that we need to interrogate evidence when it's given to us, both in terms of really trying to bottom it out, and also in terms of asking who's giving it to us and how reliable they are. And just in the same way that many will say that they don't trust Israel and they don't trust the IDF and they don't trust the Israeli government, even those people probably ought to interrogate stories given from terrorist families affiliated to proscribed terror groups who have also a long history of lying and twisting and changing and manipulating facts for the media. So I think this is a great example of media manipulation 101 in a complex and difficult and very tragic setting over a very sad story. And for that, I thank you for bringing it to our attention and for explaining it so clearly to me today, because I think it's really important to go through all the nuts and bolts. As I said, neither you nor I are telling people what to believe. We're just perhaps highlighting that there are ways to try to find out better what we might think is valid in making our decisions.
And firstly, absolutely, as I've said, or implied several times, this is not about providing another version that we believed or I believe to be true. It's just about examining all the facts. And when you examine all the facts, at the very least, suggest strongly the BBC have it wrong, even if I don't know what the right version actually is. And look, thank you for having me on here and giving me the opportunity to, run things through with it.
David Collier, thank you very much.